Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers pedestrian violations, undercover officers, and impeding an investigation, and comes to us from James McLynas for Pinellas County Sheriff's Channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. James Edward McLynas is a New York City native who was raised in Detroit and eventually decided to retire in Pinellas County, Florida. After a destructive and emotionally taxing divorce, Mr. McLynas was awarded full custody of his young daughter, and he claims that after their divorce, his estranged ex-wife started dating deputies from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office. Mr. McLynas claims that this launched a campaign of targeted harassment against him that resulted in over 150 false police reports, 7 fraudulent domestic violence injunctions, 22 false child protective investigation reports, and 4 false arrests from 2009 to 2015. During these events, Mr. McLynas began recording his interactions with the Sheriff's Office, and this eventually led him actively exposing misconduct within the department and advocating for police reform as a whole. When his complaints were consistently ignored by Pinellas County Sheriff Bob Gualtieri, Mr. McLynas decided to run against him for sheriff in 2016. And although he did not win the election, Mr. McLynas did manage to garner over 100,000 votes as an independent candidate and has publicly stated that he plans to run again. The interaction featured on today's episode occurred sometime around January 5th, 2020, and features several deputies from the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office who were parked along a residential street as they conducted an investigation at a nearby residence. Mr. McLynas began filming as he approached the scene from the middle of the street.
Just all the undercover police cars. Police sheriffs at this house. Undercover.
I don't know, take a video of
And-
tags, stuff like that.
And this one here does not look like a police vehicle.
What exactly are you doing? Just curious.
Just taking video.
See that you're doing that is any present purpose. Just ask.
It's a First Amendment protected activity.
What's that?
It's a First Amendment protected activity.
Hey, sir. You know what else is that? ID on you?
I don't need ID.
Yes, you do need ID.
Oh, no, I don't need to ID.
If you're coming into the middle of our investigation, you do.
Actually, this is the middle of the street, and I'm
And
walking
you're
on
not
a public
supposed
street.
to be in the middle of the street, so that's a violation.
Actually, there's no sidewalks here, so it's not.
You cannot be in the middle of the street.
Well, you notice you're blocking the way on the side of the street.
All right, let me get a pad. You have ID at all?
I don't have to show ID. I have not committed a crime.
Did you drive here?
No.
But you have to ID who you are.
No, I don't.
Yes, you do.
Under Florida statutes, we're not an ID upon demand state.
When an officer informs Mr. McLynas that he cannot walk in the middle of the street, Mr. McLynas argues that he can because there are no sidewalks and the officers have blocked the side of the road with their cars. Section 316.130 of the Florida statute states that, quote, "Where sidewalks are not provided, any pedestrian walking along and upon a highway shall, when practicable, walk only on the shoulder on the left side of the roadway in relation to the pedestrian's direction of travel, facing traffic which may approach from the opposite direction." Although the statute creates an exception to the rule for when walking on the shoulder is not practicable, the officers' vehicles were blocking the right side shoulder and not the left, where the statute required Mr. McLynas to walk. Because it was practicable for Mr. McLynas to walk on the left side shoulder, he was committing a type of non-criminal traffic infraction known as a pedestrian violation by walking in the middle of the road under these circumstances. Despite this, Florida's stop and identify law did not authorize the police officers to detain Mr. McLynas and demand his identification. Section 901.151 of the Florida statute states, quote, "Whenever any law enforcement officer of this state encounters any person under circumstances which reasonably indicate that such person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a violation of the criminal laws of this state or the criminal ordinances of any municipality or county, the officer may temporarily detain such person for the purpose of ascertaining the identity of the person." Because walking in the middle of the road was a non-criminal pedestrian violation and not a violation of criminal law, Mr. McLynas could not be detained under Florida law and was permitted to refuse to identify himself.
Am I being detained?
I said I was getting my notepad.
Hey. Are you writing him a ticket? You do understand when there's not a sidewalk, there's a certain direction that you need to write. You need to walk on the street, right? You can't just walk down the middle.
Well, when you have all the cars blocking the side of the road, it makes it kind of difficult.
Okay, well, guess what, Perry Mason? Since you're so good on the
Well,
First Amendment
are you a
and the
police officer?
Constitution and all that,
I'm asking you to
read the
identify yourself.
statutes. Excuse me?
I'm asking you to identify yourself. Are you a police officer?
Yes, I am.
Can you please give me your name and badge number?
No.
Are you refusing to identify yourself?
What, is there a Florida state statute that says I must?
I think it's are you a Pinellas County Sheriff?
Yes, I am.
Well, isn't it a Pinellas County Sheriff general order that when a citizen asks you to identify yourself as an officer, what if I want to file a complaint against you? How am I supposed to be able to do that?
Then you'll get it.
Mr. McLynas asks the officer if there is a Pinellas County Sheriff's Office policy that requires deputies to identify themselves, and the officer does not give a clear response. Unfortunately, the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office has not made its policies publicly available, so I was unable to confirm whether such a policy exists. While law enforcement officers generally do not have a legal duty to disclose their identities, some municipalities have passed laws requiring officers to identify themselves if asked. More commonly, a local police department will create policies or other regulations that require officers to identify themselves in certain situations. But a violation of one of these policies can usually only result in department discipline and is not considered illegal. The fact that the officers in this situation are either undercover or plainclothes officers complicates the analysis of whether they need to disclose their identity. Contrary to popular belief, undercover officers do not have to reveal their law enforcement status, even when they are asked directly. In fact, the law generally does not prohibit police officers from lying while performing their duties, and the U.S. Supreme Court has found on multiple occasions that the use of undercover agents does not violate the Constitution. For example, in the 1966 case of Hoffa versus United States, the court held that placing an undercover agent near a suspect to gather incriminating information was permissible under the Fifth Amendment. While Mr. Hoffa was on trial, he confessed to an individual who was cooperating with law enforcement that he had attempted to bribe jury members. The court concluded that the statements were not coerced, and the fact that Mr. Hoffa had been fooled into thinking the informant was a sympathetic colleague did not affect the voluntariness of his statements. Similarly, in the 1990 case of Illinois versus Perkins, the Supreme Court concluded that, quote, an undercover law enforcement officer posing as a fellow inmate need not give Miranda warnings to an incarcerated suspect before asking questions that may elicit an incriminating response. Given the discretion granted to undercover officers, even if the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office did have a policy requiring officers to identify themselves, it is possible it would not apply to the officers in this interaction.
How am I supposed to file a complaint against you?
Okay. What do you want to file a complaint for? Because if you want it, I'll give it to you.
I do want it. I've asked for it.
But let me finish my train of thought first before you interrupted me with all your Perry Mason stuff. Do you understand that there is a Florida state statute against walking in the middle of the roadway?
Which is what you
Do you understand that?
When I come out of...
It's a yes or no question.
Sir, do you understand the question that's been asked of you?
You have the, you have the street blocked.
Asked of you? Sir, the street is
you
not
have the
blocked.
street blocked.
The street
Yes.
is not blocked.
Yes.
You walk past actual vehicles that are here.
Yes.
You just drove by us. How are we blocking you?
Exactly.
You are
I guess
blocking
that
the
pretty much answers
pathway
your
on the
question,
side of the road. This is the intimidation that the Pinellas County Sheriff's try and use if you exercise your First Amendment activity.
No,
They surround
actually,
you, accuse you of crimes, refuse to identify
not a
themselves,
crime, it's a
intimidate
civil
yourself.
infraction.
Why aren't you continuing with your investigation? Why are you out here bothering me? I walk by with my camera,
Because you
videotape.
committed a civil infraction in front of me. You got a problem with that?
There is no civil infraction. You're blocking the road.
I just explained to you what you did. Walking in the middle of the road is a pedestrian violation.
And when you have the side of the road blocked and there are no sidewalks here, it's not a pedestrian violation. But nice try.
You're right. You're the expert. You know, I've only spent 20 years doing this job. You're the expert, though, right?
After 20 years, you still
What
think it's
exactly
necessary?
statute is it? Do you know what statute
After
it is?
20 years, you think it's actually necessary to come out in the street and bother people who are walking by?
You can't walk in the middle of the road.
And when you have the street blocked,
street's
the
not
side
blocked.
of the road
The
blocked,
street's not blocked.
you have the side of the road blocked.
The street's not blocked.
Sir,
Yeah.
The street's not
shine,
blocked.
shine your phone that way because I want to make sure that you see this as well, that this is on video.
Yeah, I'll shine the phone.
So from here all the way through, past the area that you actually walk through, the street is not blocked.
This
The
side of the street
vehicles
is
are on the
blocked.
curb, but you actually walk. So how is that actually blocking
side of the street
streets?
is blocked.
Okay.
And there's no sidewalks here.
So here's the thing right now. This is what I would tell you. We have an investigation that we're
I see
working
that.
on here right now, and you're impeding that investigation. So is
Actually-
there anything
actually-
else you would like to talk
Actually,
about?
by walking down the middle of the street and
Is there
conducting
anything
a First
else that you
Amendment
would like to talk
activity,
about? Is there anything else you would like
I
to
didn't
talk
want
about?
to talk to you, any of you, in the first place.
Have a good day, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
You can leave now.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
One of the officers accuses Mr. McLynas of impeding their investigation, which is not the name of a criminal offense in the state of Florida. Section 843.02 of the Florida statute states that, quote, whoever shall resist, obstruct, or oppose any officer in the execution of legal process or in the lawful execution of any legal duty without offering or doing violence to the person of the officer shall be guilty of a misdemeanor of the first degree. Section 843.01 of the Florida statutes also criminalizes resisting, obstructing, or opposing an officer with violence, but we will not discuss it in detail since it does not apply to this situation. While it is not clear exactly what conduct by Mr. McLynas the officer believed was obstructing him, recording police officers in the performance of their duties is considered First Amendment protected activity that, on its own, does not constitute obstructing an officer. The only other conduct Mr. McLynas engaged in was speaking with the officers after they spoke to him. In the 1995 case of DG versus State, the Second District Court of Appeal of Florida stated that, quote, if a police officer is not engaged in executing process on a person, is not legally detaining that person, or has not asked the person for assistance with an ongoing emergency that presents a serious threat of imminent harm to person or property, the person's words alone can rarely, if ever, rise to the level of an obstruction. Thus, obstructive conduct rather than offensive words are normally required to support a conviction under this statute. Similarly, in the 2002 case of DeRuthi versus City of Miami, the United States District Court in the Southern District of Florida determined that a police officer did not have probable cause to arrest an individual for obstructing an officer when he continued to film an encounter after being asked to return to the sidewalk. The court concluded that because the individual began moving in the direction of the sidewalk after being asked, quote, the fact that he continued to film and did not move as quickly as possible does not make an arrest for resisting, obstruction, or opposing an officer reasonable. Although the Southern District of Florida's decision in this case was overturned by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals for other reasons, the Court of Appeals did not invalidate the District Court's analysis of the obstruction issue. Therefore, given the way the courts have interpreted this statute, it seems highly unlikely that a court would conclude that Mr. McLynas was engaged in obstructive conduct.
I still can't walk down this side of the street.
Asked you and told you to leave. Leave now.
So I have to leave the street.
Leave this investigation right now.
So where is the investigation? Where's the blue line? Is it over here? Is it over here? Is it over here? Is she impeding the investigation too? I'm just curious.
Mr. McLynas continued to film the police vehicles as he slowly left the scene without further incident, and went on to attempt to file complaints against the deputies involved. Mr. McLynas began by submitting a public records request for the names of the deputies. However, his request was denied, because Section 119.07 of Florida's public record law provides an exception for, quote, any information revealing undercover personnel of any criminal justice agency. After speaking to Mr. McLynas, he pointed out another interesting aspect of this encounter that is easy to miss if you're not watching closely. When Mr. McLynas initially approached this red SUV that appears to be an undercover patrol vehicle, there was a handicap placard hanging on the rearview mirror. But at some point in the encounter, the officer occupying that vehicle removed the placard, and it is no longer visible when Mr. McLynas pans in that direction. Mr. McLynas told me that he also submitted a public records request for the information regarding this placard, but that request was once again denied under the authority of Section 119.07, which also excludes, quote, any information revealing surveillance techniques or procedures. Mr. McLynas told me that he does not intend to file a lawsuit because he is currently wrapped up in too many legal battles to take on another one, but he plans to continue his work of exposing police misconduct and running for sheriff until elected. Overall, the Pinellas County Sheriff's deputies get an F. Because although there is an argument to be made that Mr. McLynas was committing a civil infraction, the officers displayed a fundamental misunderstanding of Florida's identification laws, baselessly accused Mr. McLynas of impeding their investigation, and maintained a rude and condescending attitude throughout the encounter. The most alarming part of this interaction is the fact that none of the deputies even attempted to engage in a productive dialogue with Mr. McLynas. Instead, the deputies immediately demanded to see his ID and accused him of committing a violation. If the deputies were legitimately working undercover, then their refusal to identify themselves could be considered justified. However, it certainly does create a catch-22 scenario, because without the deputy's name, it would be extremely difficult to file a complaint against them. But if the deputy were to be required to identify himself upon the demand of a citizen, then the advantages of working undercover are dissolved. This is yet another component of the American policing system that requires very complex solutions that consider both the legal and ethical implications of either side. The courts often lose sight of how their rulings translate practically into the real world, but finding a legal solution that properly maintains a balance between protecting the assets of the state and offering the public the level of transparency they deserve is a difficult task. Nonetheless, there is no doubt that there were less hostile and intrusive ways to approach this situation, and regardless of whether they were working undercover, the Pinellas County Sheriff's deputies could have been more cordial and respectful while maintaining the integrity of their identities and investigation. Mr. McLynas gets an A- for exercising his rights peacefully and respectfully, remaining calm and collected throughout the encounter, and following up this interaction with the proper channel of complaint. Mr. McLynas has been recording police for over 10 years, and it is citizens like him who have laid the foundation for what the auditing community has become today. Of course, there are a litany of other factors that have also contributed to the evolution of First Amendment auditing, but it was individuals like Tom Zebra and Mr. McLynas who ushered in a new form of citizen journalism and found a home on YouTube. While it is clear that Mr. McLynas has a thorough understanding of his constitutional rights, he unintentionally offered the deputies an opportunity to argue that he was committing a civil infraction by walking in the middle of the street. Whether or not Mr. McLynas actually committed this violation is for a court to decide, but Mr. McLynas could have filmed the deputies from the opposite side of the street and likely rendered the very same interaction without being accused of committing an infraction. I commend Mr. McLynas for remaining professional throughout the interaction and for his many contributions to exposing police misconduct over the years. I highly recommend giving your support to Mr. McLynas' channel, and be sure to let him know that I sent you. You can find a link in the description below. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the ATA Patreon page for more police interaction content.